Your parents left you nothing. Everything goes to your cousin.
Nothing? After I paid their bills for years?
I hope there are no hard feelings. There won't be.
I'm just stopping every payment today.
I had spent most of my adult life believing that being the dependable child meant something. Whenever my parents needed help, I was the one they called. If the property taxes were due, I sent money. If the house needed repairs, I covered part of the bill. When my father said the mortgage was becoming difficult, I started sending a regular amount every month. At first, it was supposed to be temporary. Then temporary became normal. I never made a big deal about it. I had a stable career, lived carefully, and avoided unnecessary debt. My parents often told me they were proud that I had become responsible and independent. Those words made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. My cousin, on the other hand, lived very differently. She was charming, social, and always seemed to be moving from one exciting plan to another. She tried businesses that lasted a few months, bought things she could barely afford, and somehow always had relatives ready to rescue her. My parents adored her. They said she was full of life and simply needed more support than I did. I tried not to resent it. Whenever the difference in treatment bothered me, I reminded myself that family was not a competition. I told myself that my parents loved us in different ways. Then they died within a relatively short period of each other, and everything I thought I understood about my family changed. After the funerals and the exhausting days of paperwork, phone calls, condolences, and cleaning out rooms filled with decades of memories, I was asked to attend a meeting at the family lawyer's office. I walked in expecting the estate to be divided in some reasonable way. I did not expect to become rich. I did not feel entitled to everything. But I had spent years helping my parents stay financially secure, so I assumed I would at least receive a fair share of what remained. My cousin arrived dressed, as if she were attending a business lunch rather than the reading of a will. She looked nervous, but there was something else in her expression too, something almost like anticipation. The lawyer opened the file. He read the formal language slowly. The house went to my cousin. The remaining investment accounts went to my cousin. The personal property of significant value went to my cousin. Even several insurance-related proceeds and financial assets were directed to her. I sat completely still. Then the lawyer reached my name. What my parents had left me was essentially sentimental material: family photographs, old papers, a few personal objects, and a short written message about how proud they were of the life I had built. That was it. I remember staring at the folder in front of me, while the room seemed to become strangely quiet. My cousin shifted in her chair and finally said that she hoped there would be no hard feelings. No hard feelings. I had helped my parents for years. I had sent money when they told me the mortgage was difficult. I had paid repair bills. I had covered emergencies. I had rearranged my own plans more times than I could count because they said they needed help. And now, after all of that, nearly everything had been handed to the person who had contributed almost nothing. I could have exploded. I could have demanded explanations from the lawyer. I could have accused my cousin of manipulating them. Instead, I asked one question: "Is that everything?" The lawyer hesitated. Then he said there were outstanding obligations associated with parts of the estate, and that the executor would be working through them. That sentence caught my attention. Outstanding obligations. I asked for clarification. The picture that emerged over the next several days was far more complicated than my cousin seemed to understand. The house was not free and clear. There was still substantial debt connected to it. Some of the money I had been sending my parents every month had been helping them keep up with those payments. Worse, several expenses I thought were simply my parents' living costs were connected to financial decisions made for the benefit of my cousin. My parents had helped her repeatedly. They had backed some of her plans, covered shortages, and moved money around to keep everything functioning. The estate looked impressive if you only focused on the assets, but assets came with bills. And for years, I had unknowingly been part of the system keeping those bills paid. That realization hurt almost more than the will itself. My parents had not simply chosen my cousin over me after their deaths. They had used my reliability to support a financial structure that benefited her while telling me they were struggling. I went home that night and opened my banking records. There it was, the recurring transfer I had sent every month. I had never canceled it because, even after my parents died, I assumed estate expenses still needed to be handled during the transition. I stared at the transfer for a long time, then I canceled it. Next, I reviewed every other automatic payment and financial arrangement tied to my parents' household. Anything that was legally mine and that I was voluntarily paying, I stopped. No angry family message. No public accusation. I simply withdrew my money. For the first time in years, I stopped rescuing people who had already decided I was not worth including. At first, nobody noticed. The first week was quiet. The second week was quiet too. Then the calls started. My cousin called me one afternoon and asked whether there had been a problem with the bank. I knew exactly what she meant. I told her there was no bank problem. She explained that a payment connected to the house had not gone through. I said, calmly, that payment came from my account. There was a pause. She seemed confused. Apparently, she had assumed the money would continue automatically. She said our parents had always handled those expenses. I replied that our parents had often handled them using money I sent. Another pause. Then she told me that the estate was still being settled and that stopping payments now was creating unnecessary problems. I reminded her that the will gave her the property. If she owned the asset, she also owned the responsibility that came with it. That conversation ended badly. Within hours, other relatives began contacting me. Some said I was being petty. Some said I was punishing my cousin because I was jealous. Others told me that my parents must have had a reason for making their decision and that I needed to respect their wishes. That argument made my answer very simple. I am respecting their wishes, I said. They wanted her to have everything. She has it. The family did not like that answer. They wanted me to accept the emotional meaning of the will while continuing the financial behavior that had made the arrangement possible. In other words, they wanted my cousin to receive the benefits while I continued carrying part of the burden. I refused. Over the next month, the situation became more serious. The house required payments my cousin had not planned for. Insurance, maintenance, taxes, debt, and utilities added up quickly. A property that had seemed like a fortune at the lawyer's office began to look very different when the monthly costs arrived. My cousin called again. This time, she was angry. She accused me of setting her up to fail. That almost made me laugh. I had not created the will. I had not given her the property. I had not created the debts. I had merely stopped paying bills that were not mine. She insisted that our parents had wanted the house kept in the family. I said that if keeping it mattered to her, she could use the assets she inherited to support it. She replied that some of those assets were not as liquid as she expected, and that there were delays and expenses. Again, I told her that this was part of inheriting an estate. For the first time, the word inheritance seemed less attractive to her. What followed was a strange reversal. During my parents' lives, I had been treated as the person who did not need help. My cousin was the one everyone worried about. Now she had been given almost everything, yet people still expected me to protect her. An aunt called and told me that I was financially stronger and should help, just for a few months. I asked her how much she planned to contribute. She became quiet. An uncle told me that family should support family. I asked whether that principle had applied when the will was written. He changed the subject. Another relative suggested that I should lend my cousin money and let her repay me after the estate was settled. I declined. I had finally understood something important. Every family member who called me selfish was free to help her themselves. None of them volunteered. They wanted generosity to remain my job. I started going through old statements, messages, and records, not because I intended to fight the will, but because I needed to understand what had happened. The more I reviewed, the clearer the pattern became. For years, my parents had presented themselves as financially strained. Whenever I sent money, I believed I was helping them stay in the home they loved. But money is flexible. Once it enters an account, it can support many things. My support had freed up other funds. Those other funds had helped my cousin. Maybe my parents did not see it as deception. Maybe they believed I was successful enough to manage on my own, while my cousin needed a head start. But the result was the same. I had been subsidizing a family system that valued my usefulness more than my place in the family. That truth was painful, but it was also freeing. I stopped asking why I had not been chosen. Instead, I started asking why I had spent so many years trying to earn a kind of fairness that never came. My cousin eventually requested a face-to-face meeting. We met at a quiet cafe. She looked exhausted. The confidence she had shown at the lawyer's office was gone. She admitted that she had known our parents planned to leave her the house, but she claimed she had not understood the full financial picture. She said they had told her I was already secure and did not need anything. That phrase hit me harder than I expected. I did not need anything. Apparently, independence had become the reason I deserved less. The sacrifices that made me stable had not earned appreciation. They had become evidence that I could be excluded safely. My cousin said she never asked them to cut me out completely. I believed that might be true. But she had accepted the arrangement. And after inheriting everything, her first instinct had not been to question the fairness of it. Her first concern had been whether my money would keep arriving. She asked whether I would consider helping until she could decide what to sell. I said no. Not angrily, not dramatically, just no. She asked whether I wanted to see her lose the house. I told her I did not want her to lose anything, but I was no longer going to pay to make sure she kept it. Those were two different things. Eventually, she sold some assets. She cut expenses. She considered whether keeping the house made financial sense. For the first time, she had to make choices based on what she could actually afford rather than what the family would rescue. Some relatives continued blaming me. Others slowly began to understand. A few even apologized after seeing records showing how much I had contributed over the years. But the most important change was not in them. It was in me. I had spent years believing that love meant stepping in before anyone had to ask twice. I had confused being dependable with being obligated. I had thought that if I gave enough, helped enough, and caused few enough problems, my family would eventually see my value. The will showed me the truth in the harshest possible way. They had seen my value. They had simply defined it differently. My value was that I could handle things. My value was that I did not complain. My value was that I would pay the bill. My value was that I would sacrifice quietly. So when the final papers said my cousin got nearly everything, I did not fight for the house. I did not beg for a share. I did not start a legal war. I changed one thing I still controlled. I stopped participating in the arrangement. Months later, my life was calmer. The money I had once sent every month began accumulating in my own savings. I used some of it to take a trip I had postponed for years. I invested more. I fixed things in my own home without feeling guilty. Most importantly, I learned to stop treating every family emergency as my personal responsibility. My cousin eventually found a way forward. Whether she kept every inherited asset or sold some of them stopped being my concern. That was the real ending. Not revenge, not a courtroom victory. Not watching someone lose everything. The victory was realizing I no longer needed to earn a place in a family that had already shown me the role they expected me to play. At the lawyer's office, I thought I had been left with nothing, but that was not completely true. I left with the truth. And once I had that, I stopped paying for the illusion.